the Greeks come up with philosophy, and particularly Athenian Greeks come up with philosophy. And if you know what it is, you can break the word apart. You can split it in half. Phil, like Philadelphia, means love. Soph means knowledge. So philosophy is literally the love of wisdom. And what marks a change with the past here is that early Greek philosophers are really concerned with developing some critical or rational thought about the nature of the universe, what makes people humans. And where they're notable is that they kind of take the religious out of the equation, and instead of focusing on explaining questions by, well, gods did this, they look for natural responses. And there are all sorts of precursors to the major Athenian philosophers, but the ones that you're probably most familiar with are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Much like a lot of people we've looked at so far, Socrates didn't write anything down, but his pupils did. And for Socrates, the goal of education is really to improve the individual, to make somebody a good person on their own right, and in doing so, to make them a good member of society. And in many ways, you can see parallels to Confucius's ideas from last week. I really love Socrates' style of teaching, and if you pay attention to how I teach, I embrace it. It's called the Socratic method, which means that a teacher doesn't just shove information down your throat, but instead gives you the opportunity to think critically and form your own conclusions. So what this Socratic method does is it asks students questions. When they come up with the answer, asks a further question. Right? So in the context of this class, I might say, what's the difference between Herodotus and Thucydides? And you might say, well, Herodotus told these really big, grand stories, but Thucydides focused on the facts. In a Socratic method, I would then follow up and say, okay, why is that important? What does that tell us about them? How can this lead us to insight about what each of them valued? Then you respond, and I ask another question that allows you to come up with your own understanding of this. Unfortunately for Socrates, this is seen as really subversive because people might say, hey, Socrates, what's the best type of government? And he would say, well, what do you think? And they'd say, well, Athens might be. And he would say, well, what do you think are problems with Athens' government? Because of that, and especially in the wake of the defeats of the Peloponnesian Wars, he is charged with corrupting the youth by encouraging them to think and not just swallow whole everything that Athens' government says. He is actually convicted of that crime. He's sentenced to death. He's given a whole variety of options to get out of that, but instead takes his punishment, which is to drink a tea made out of hemlock leaves, which contains arsenic in it, and kill himself. Probably his most important pupil is a guy named Plato. And Plato's big question is, how do we know what's real? This is a question that's taken up by philosophers and scientists well after he's around. And for Plato, the notion is that really we can become deluded or led astray by all sorts of different things in this world. A good way to think about this is optical illusions. You think you see one thing, but in reality it's another. So what Plato tries to do is say, look, we're really two different people. Kind of a good equivalent would be to think about us as a body and a soul, but that's not how Plato would have said it. Our body is capable of error, our soul isn't. And when you mix the two together, our body misleads us. So what our obligation is that we need to try and free ourselves from everything that our body deludes us from and come to some type of universal truth. His student, Aristotle, is completely the opposite, which I love, that many of these folks, they build on their teacher's ideas, but they go a completely different direction. Aristotle is not only Plato's student, he also becomes a tutor to Alexander the Great, and he rejects Plato's ideas and instead says, well, actually, we've been given all these great things. We've been given our senses. So if we go out and we explore the world in as much depth as we can, one thing that we might be able to do is we might be able to say, based on everything we've observed, we can make some conclusions. That means he's big into research. He's big into classification. He writes on all sorts of different things like government and ethics and logic and astronomy and geology, physics. He's in many ways the father of biology. He wanders northern Greece for years, cataloging plants and animals. And one thing that I want us to think about based on primary sources is, with these folks, how do they, in this new world of Greece, where Athens is a dominant empire or is being beaten in the Peloponnesian Wars and is maybe going into decline, how do these folks maybe assess government, and how do they think about what the proper obligations of individuals are?